Morning, year 8, or afternoon, or whenever you're watching this. We find ourselves here again in lockdown. I hope you're staying well at home, and hopefully this will be over sooner rather than later. We'll see us all back in school soon. 8D, you would this lesson today have been doing lesson 3 in your workbook. So you need to turn to lesson 3 in your workbook that you've got at home. And I'm going to talk you through how to do that lesson now, okay? Now, lesson 3 in your workbook hopefully should look a little bit like this. Obviously, ignore the timelines on the other side. That's the sort of thing we always have at the start of the lesson. You're going to start with the Quizlet. So as you'll see, this lesson is all about what colonialism, that means the empire, looked like in the Caribbean. And the 3 key words that you need to know for this lesson are plantation, which is an estate or a farm where sugar and tobacco is grown. You might remember from when we did a little bit on enslavement earlier on in cycle A. Slave labor, forced work which is undertaken by slaves who are crucially not paid, and an atrocity. We've spoken about that word before, but it's an extremely wicked or cruel act. The first job that you need to do is circle the correct definitions to each of those words, whether that question 2 is true or false, and decide how far you think the British government controlled the empire. What I mean by that is, was the empire controlled by the government, or was it controlled by private businesses like the East India Company in India? Pause the video here and do those tasks now. Okay, so the answers, you should have completed tasks 1 to 4. The answers, the correct definition of imperialism is taking over countries and claiming them as your own. It's another way really of saying empire. So imperialism is the second one, taking over countries and claiming them as your own. Now at this point, you should have a green pen out. At this point, you should have a green pen out, and you should be ticking or correcting your answers. Thanks. Question 2, true or false? Oliver Cromwell did not want to conquer Ireland. It is false. Oliver Cromwell took a large interest in Ireland, as we heard last lesson when we spoke about Ireland and what colonialism was like there. Question 3, circle the correct definition for privateer. A privateer is a British pirate who had permission from the Queen to raid, in this case, Queen Elizabeth I. We spoke about that in cycle A. And how far did the British government control the empire? Well, really, that was up to you. There's no right or wrong answer. I think if it were me personally, I think I would probably circle around 3 to 4, because as we've seen, actually, it's possibly more private companies, possibly more self-interest when we look at who really controls the empire. And the government, like we saw last lesson with the Irish potato famine, take maybe a laissez-faire, a leave well alone attitude to the empire. They're not really that bothered as long as it's making profit and money. Now in this lesson, we're going to look again at colonialism in the Caribbean and ask ourselves the same questions about how it was run. But before we do that, you need to study the artifacts which are underneath the Quizlet and are also on the screen now. And then you need to answer the questions underneath. What can you see? What can you work out about why they would be used in the Caribbean? That's a badly worded question. You should say, what can you work out about why they might or would be used in the Caribbean? And the challenge question, what was the purpose of having colonies in the Caribbean? Pause the video here and answer those questions now. Should take you at least 3 minutes. Pause the video. Okay, so hopefully you've circled some things that you can see, and hopefully you've been able to infer that these items are probably going to be used for some form of punishment. Certainly we can see punishment happening in the middle picture with somebody being whipped or flogged, you might call it. The contraptions which are around these enslaved people's necks, as they are enslaved people, around their necks or on their faces are also designed to be used to punish people. Now, the important thing here is that we pause and think about why the British might need to punish enslaved people in the Caribbean. Now, it's a simple fact that in the Caribbean, there were far more there were far more enslaved people who, of course, had been transported, forced migration from Africa to the Caribbean than there were British people. British people did migrate, as you will see and read later on, and did move to the Caribbean to work mostly, but there were far, far fewer British people than there were enslaved people. So punishment is a way of controlling the enslaved population and preventing rebellions from happening. But as we will see today, it certainly didn't stop rebellions in the Caribbean. But what's important here is that we make sure that we're thinking about our 6 things that we're trying to test as to whether they existed in the empire. And we've spoken about this before, but control from Britain, military power, migration. We said they were all things that the British Empire would need in order to work. It needs to be controlled by the government. They need a large army, or punishment perhaps, to stop rebellions. And they need migration. They need British people to, or people from elsewhere in the empire, to migrate, sometimes forced, to go and do the jobs. We also have spoken about the 3 things which we're testing as to whether actually they existed in the empire. We all agreed the Victorians thought their empire was for a civilizing mission, to make things better around the world, rivalry with European nations, for Britain to stay the best and number 1, and for making profit or money. But again, we're asking the question, well, did all of those things actually exist in the British Empire, in all places? Today, we're going to think about these questions in relation to the Caribbean. Now, the next thing that I need you to do is actually skip the reading, which is on the next page. Now, of course, you can go and read that in your own time if you'd like to, but it's not essential. You're going to skip that page and you're going to go to this timeline, which you can see on the screen now. Now, the first thing that you're going to need to do is pause this video now and read the timeline. It should take you about 1.5 minutes. Pause the video, read the timeline now. Now, once you've finished reading, you can start to work through tasks 1, 2, 3, and the challenge. The first thing that you're going to do is circle examples of exploitation. Now, we spoke about exploitation. No, we didn't. We spoke about exploitation last lesson, and we said that somebody who is exploiting something or somebody else means that they're taking advantage of it. For example, I would be exploiting my position as a teacher if I turned to a student and said, "Give me all your dinner money now, or I'll give you a detention." That would be exploiting my position and my power as a teacher. I'm taking advantage. What I need you to do is read through and circle as many examples as you can see of English or British people exploiting the Caribbean. That means the land or enslaved people there. So circle as many examples as we can of Britain exploiting the Caribbean. That's task 1. Task 2, you need to put a box around examples of English atrocities in the Caribbean. Now remember, an atrocity is an extremely wicked or cruel act, as you can see on the screen now. So task 2, you're circling examples of atrocities, wicked or cruel acts. Task 3, you're going to put examples, or put a star next to examples of the civilizing mission, Britain trying to make things better in the Caribbean. Now I'd question who they're making it better for, perhaps. And then finally, in the challenge, you're going to add numbers 1 to 5 on 5 boxes to show the worst examples of behavior. And 1 would be your worst example. Now I'm going to give you an example for each of those, just so this is really clear. But if you're comfortable now and you know what you're doing, pause the video and go off and do this on your own. If you're not, stay with us and listen to my examples. So task 1 says I'm looking for examples of English exploitation. So I'm going to start by reading at the beginning, and I can see that that one is to do with Spain, so I don't think that's going to help me answer my question. And the next one is about English pirates beginning to raid Jamaica, and that belongs to Spain at this time. Now, I could say that that's an example of pirates exploiting their position, but those pirates aren't necessarily, privateering has stopped by now, actually. Those pirates aren't necessarily working for the government, so I don't think that's the best example. It says here in the next one, 1655, that Jamaica is captured by the British. They continue to exploit slave labor to maximize profits. They're using enslaved people. That is an example for me of exploitation. So I would put a circle around it. Find at least 2. Now I'm going to read on now and look for atrocities. And I can see the next one, an earthquake. Well, that's really bad, but it's maybe not Britain who've caused that. That's a natural disaster. 1700, there are over 5 slaves to every 1 English settler. That's really important for me to know, but it's not an atrocity. 1736, a slave plot against their owners was uncovered in Antigua, and 88 slaves are brutally executed. 88 slaves being executed, I think, is an atrocity, a cruel or wicked act. I would put a box around that. Now, next I'm looking for examples of a civilizing mission, Britain making things better. So I'm going to read on, and I can see that the next few actually are about slave rebellions. So I don't think they're the best examples. But in 1807, it says the abolition of the slave trade in Britain and the Empire. Buying enslaved people is banned. Now, that seems to me like an example of Britain trying to make things better for enslaved people. So I might put a star next to that. And then in 1833, I can see the same. That might be another good example. So I'd put a star next to it. That should make sense now. Pause the video here if you hadn't already, and complete tasks 1, 2, and 3 and the challenge now. Well done for completing that task. Now, before we move on, I just want to pause and think about something for a moment. As I said in the video, and I'm sure those of you who didn't do it with me also did, the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery in 1807 and 1833, we might say are examples of a civilizing mission. And certainly there were people in Britain who were very against enslavement and the slave trade and fought really hard to get them abolished, get them cancelled and banned. People like William Wilberforce or Thomas Clarkson, or even freed slaves like Aluda Equiano. And it's really important that we remember what they contributed, because it was really significant what they did. And they were clearly, in many ways, good people with good hearts. But I don't think it's a coincidence that slave rebellions happened before both of those events. And certainly, to an extent, those new laws which were brought in by Britain to help enslaved people were partly motivated by money by profit. There were so many rebellions happening so more frequently in the Caribbean that Britain wasn't able to make as much profit from sugar as they had been before. And perhaps one way they could combat that was through getting rid of enslavement. Something to ponder and consider as we go through the rest of this lesson, year 8. Anyway, the next task I need you to do is based around this hexagon. Now, you'll probably remember that it's pretty similar to the one that we saw last lesson when we looked at Ireland. And we're going to use it in exactly the same way. And you're going to read some stories in a minute. But we're going to read this first story about the Baptist War in Jamaica together. I need you to pause the video here and read it in your head now. Okay, I'm going to read it to you as well. The Baptist War, led by Samuel Sharp. The Baptist War, also known as the Christmas Rebellion, was an 11-day rebellion that mobilized as many as 60,000 of Jamaica's 300,000 slaves in 1831 to 32. That means 60,000 Jamaican slaves joined the rebellion. It was considered the largest slave rebellion in the British Caribbean. The name Christmas Rebellion came from the fact that the uprising began shortly after December the 25th, Christmas Day. It was also called the Baptist War because many of the rebels were Baptists. Baptism or Baptists is a type of Christianity that was very popular among enslaved people in the Caribbean. On Christmas Day, the leaders of the uprising went on strike, demanding more free time and a working wage. They refused to work until the plantation owners met their demands, and that led to the sugarcane fields being set on fire, and many fled to other communities. The rebellion ended during the first week of January 1832. However, fighting continued for another 2 months, fighting in Jamaica's mountainous interior. So that means away from the sea in Jamaica, where there are mountains. At the end of the fighting, over 200 rebels had been killed. More than 300 enslaved men and women were then executed, including Samuel Sharp in the picture, who was hanged by his neck. Now, the next step, year 8, is to consider which of our 6 things does this story about the Baptist War show. So I'd like you to think about that, pause the video, and think about that for the next 30 seconds. And if you're ready and you're comfortable, go on and start to add details from this story about the Baptist War to your hexagon. If you're not sure, if you unpause the video, I'll go through it with you. So either way, pause the video here and think for 30 seconds. Which of our 6 points or ideas might this story link to? Pause the video and think. Okay, if you're not sure, I will talk about it now. So if I read through this story, I can see that it's telling me, first of all, about a rebellion. And it's also telling me at the end that Britain have put that rebellion or stopped that rebellion quite brutally. Now, it suggests to me that the people they've used to do that are soldiers. So I'm going to say that this shows military power because soldiers are being used to punish the slaves and stop the rebellion. And hopefully, I guess, stop future rebellions. So the first one I think it links to is military power down there in the bottom right. But I also think that I could probably link this to migration. In fact, all the stories which we'll read later today link in some way to migration because it's either British people migrating to the Caribbean to do these jobs, run the plantations, or it's people from West Africa being forced to move as part of the slave trade by the British Empire. So this still links to migration as well. I also think that this might link to making profit, because clearly the reason they're stopping the rebellion is that so that Britain can continue to sell sugar and other goods grown on the plantations to make money. And they've also burnt down all the sugar plants. And Britain would be keen to stop that happening again, because that's going to stop them making money. So I think this also links to making profit, because that's why Britain wants to stop this rebellion. So if it were me, I actually think that I would write this somewhere in between those three. And I'm going to show you that now. Hopefully you can still see what I'm doing on the screen. So I think I might just put a text box there, and I'm just going to write, oops, drop my mouse, sorry, we'll try that again. I'm just going to try putting a text box here, and I would write something like this. I'm going to take, like last time on Ireland, the heading from the top. I'm going to write the Baptist War, and then I'm just going to put a reason why I've put it here. So, well, I think making profit, or profit, they stop rebellion so can still make money. Great. Yours would obviously be in the hexagon. I've got a bit more space than you, so I'm going to use it. I'm going to say military power, because soldiers used to stop rebellion and punish enslaved people. And you can write in note form like I'm doing. You don't have to worry too much about writing in full sentences. And finally, migration, enslaved people forced to move from West Africa to Caribbean. Okay, so that's the sort of thing that I'd be writing if I were you. Now, some of the stories that you're going to read shortly will have dates, years, and things like that on. It'd be a good idea to add the year too, because that's going to be really useful for revision. Dates, like I always say, are powerful facts to use in your claim paragraphs. You'll also see on the screen that yellow box, which says, if you think the reading shows how Britain didn't do one of the headings, write it in a different colour pen. We did that last time with Ireland. So you might say, for instance, that this one shows Britain not doing a civilizing mission as well, because, well, they're executing the enslaved people after the rebellion. So you might add another little note next to the civilizing mission in a different color. Let's do that now to reflect that. So let's put this one in red, and I'm going to have the Baptist War again at the top, so I know where it's come from. And then I'm going to say not a civilizing mission, as executing enslaved people. Of course, you could always argue enslavement isn't particularly civilized either. We'll ignore that because we're not American. We don't want a Z. Not as executing enslaved people after the rebellion. Okay, so if you think it doesn't or does link to one, but shows how Britain didn't do it, or perhaps, and you will read some of these stories, enslaved people doing it for themselves, enslaved people civilizing themselves, I mean, then you can add it in a different color. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for you to do here. Now I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, because I'm going to go on and show you the stories and where you can find them. So what you are going to do is, first of all, go to Microsoft Teams now. When you go to Microsoft Teams, give me 1 second. Let's make sure I'm sharing the right screen. When you go to Microsoft Teams, you're going to want to navigate to your Teams page, which is on the side here. Now, mine's obviously a lot more busy than yours because I'm in lots of teams because, of course, year 8, I'm very, very important. And you're going to go to, I'm not that important, you're going to go to the History Year 8 team, and you'll see that you can go, this is your assignment here, 9D lesson for today. So you could click on View Assignment, or you can go to Assignments, okay? And if you go to the assignments and click on 9D history lesson for today, and you will see that it looks like this. You then need to click on Caribbean Stories here at the bottom. Now you can load these up on Microsoft Teams and it will look like this. And you will see that if you scroll down, there are loads and loads of stories about the British Empire in the Caribbean. You're going to read a selection of these. I would suggest that you spend 10 minutes in silence reading as many of these stories as you can. I'd recommend you spend only 10 minutes. If you want some variety, rather than doing them straight as you go down the page, you might pick ones at different points. And you're going to want to aim to read about 6 or 7 stories. So spend 10 minutes reading those stories in silence and read 6 or 7. And as you read them, I'm going to stop sharing this screen. As you read them, you're just simply going to fill in or continue to fill in your hexagon, just like we did with Ireland last lesson, okay? So there are 2 things really you need to do. The first thing is to copy from the screen now or write in your own words inside your hexagon about the Baptist War. Then you're going to open the Caribbean stories in the assignment for 9D on Teams. And then you're going to continue to fill in that hexagon. Pause the video for 10 minutes, and read and add notes to your hexagon. Pause the video and do that now. Okay, now once you have done that, you can move on to the last page of your workbook. Now again, I'll start again. Once you have done that, you can move on to the last page for this lesson in your workbook, as the next page in your workbook, basically. And you will see this. Now again, we've seen this before when we did our lesson on Ireland, and you're going to treat it in exactly the same way. Based on what you've got written in your hexagon from the previous activity, and what we did earlier on the timeline, you should now have a pretty good idea of which of our 6 things actually happened and were actually important in the Caribbean. And what I need you to do, just like we did with Ireland, is shade in each of the segments of that hexagon to show how important that thing was. So for example, if you thought profit was really important, then you would shade it all the way. If you thought migration is only half important, you would shade it halfway. Now I'm going to add an extra layer of complexity if you want to challenge yourself and think more deeply here. Because like we said, or probably like you've seen, there's not many examples of the civilizing mission in the Caribbean, but there are lots of examples of enslaved people, you might argue, civilizing themselves. So if you think that was important in the Caribbean, but you think it wasn't something Britain did, then just like we did on our hexagon, you can shade it in a different color to show that, okay? And you might decide that others are the same. Again, you could shade those in a different color to show that it was important in the Caribbean, but it's not Britain that is doing it. Or maybe that Britain are doing the opposite of that thing. So pause this video and shade that. In fact, don't do that. If you look at the next page, or this what's on the screen now on the left, you'll see an example of this. So this student has crossed out rivalry with European nations because they don't think it's important. And then you can see what they've shaded in afterwards. Everybody pause the video and complete that task now. It should take you 2 minutes. Pause the video, do that now. Okay, and once you have done that, again, you can use this example that's on the screen right now to help you, but you need to write down what you think was the most important factor. So you might have shaded, it might be obvious, like this student has shaded profit the most, that's the most important. You might have shaded a couple in the whole way. You need to decide which one you think is the most important and write it down. Once you've done that, you need to explain why you think that one was so important. Now, you're going to do that by using examples from the stories, facts, and also you need to use 2 words from that table, the yellow and green columns. You need to use one from each. The one on the screen right now is a really good example. I'm going to read it to you. I chose profit because it was of significant importance. For example, Liverpool made a major amount of money from selling slaves and trades, which enriched the Industrial Revolution. However, a large amount of importance goes to military power because they need to help with the rebels. So you can see here that this person has used specific facts about Liverpool and about dealing with rebellions. They've also used words from either table like significance or significant. So again, explain using facts from the stories and 2 words, one from each column of that table. It should take you 5 minutes, and that should be the absolute best thing, the thing that you spend the most time over and the most time thinking about in this lesson. Because I'm asking you to bring everything that you've learned together and write a piece about it. Pause the video here, spend 5 minutes writing that now. Pause the video and write. Now you might have, oh, sorry, actually, first of all, well done for finishing the lesson. That's the end of the lesson. You might have noticed that behind me, I'm in a different place to where I was during the last lockdown, and I'm sat in front of my bookshelf just to prove that I am really into history and there is lots of history books here. But also I'm gonna maybe do, I think, a bit of a Joe Wicks to help you have something fun to watch and look out for when I'm in, or when we're doing these lessons. So you can see some things behind me. Now, the first thing behind me, this is a picture that actually my grandfather drew for me on my 18th birthday. This is a picture of a ceremonial axe, which was found in an archaeological excavation of Troy. Troy is a ancient city in Greece, or in modern day Turkey actually, but was run by ancient Greeks. You might have heard of it in the Helena of Troy, etc. Troy, the film with Brad Pitt, you might have seen. Well, it's a real place, and this axe is believed to have belonged to a king, either Xerxes or Agamemnon, we're not sure. But this was his ceremonial axe that was found in about 1905 in an archaeological dig. My granddad did this for me when I was, or turned 18. So that's my object for this week. Next week, I will have a different historical artifact or object behind me that you can look out for at the end of my video. But hopefully, we won't be doing this for too long, and I will see you soon. Fingers crossed. It's quite hard to put things back when you've got a laptop balancing on your lap. See you next week, Year 8.